All right, let's get into it. Today we're talking about one of the most powerful and honestly most mysterious empires of the ancient world. A civilization that gave Rome a serious run for its money, completely dominated the seas, and then was so totally destroyed it was almost wiped from the history books. We're talking about the legendary empire of Carthage.
And when I say lost, I mean really lost. Just check out this quote from the famous novelist Gustave Flaubert. Back in 1858, he was trying to write about Carthage and was so overwhelmed by the lack of information, he basically said he was done for, that he had nothing to go on. That's because Carthage was like a ghost, a titan of the ancient world whose story was told almost entirely by the enemies who wiped it out. So to really get to the truth, we need to go back, even before Carthage, to the people who started it all.
Before there was Carthage, there were the Phoenicians. These folks were a brilliant culture from a tiny little strip of coast in what's now Lebanon. And they weren't your typical conquerors, with huge marching armies. Nope. They were masters of something far more powerful: trade.
I mean, they were literally stuck between the mountains and the sea. They didn't have much of a choice. They had to become the best sailors in the world. For them, the Mediterranean Sea wasn't a barrier. It was their personal superhighway. And on that highway, they moved one of the most valuable things in the ancient world.
This right here, this color, the process to make it was absolutely insane. First, you had to get thousands, and I mean thousands of these tiny murex sea snails. Then, you had to carefully pull out this one little gland. You'd expose the gunk from it to the sun, and it would magically turn into this stunning, deep purple. It was so difficult to make that the dye was literally worth more than its weight in gold. It became the ultimate symbol of royalty. It's really no wonder the Greeks called them the phonikes, which pretty much means the purple people.
But their greatest export wasn't a color. It was an idea. The Phoenicians gave us the alphabet, a simple system where symbols represented sounds. The letters I'm using right now, they're descendants of this system. They also perfected navigation using the stars, especially the North Star, which the Greeks actually called the Phoenician star. Combine that genius with their amazing ships, and you've got the culture that basically connected the entire ancient world. So, as things got a little dicey back home, with big empires like Assyria starting to move in, the Phoenicians did what they did best. They looked west. And on the coast of North Africa, they founded their greatest colony, what they called Carthage, or New City. We know it better as Carthage.
The founding story of the city is just perfect. It's about a princess named Dido who's on the run from her murderous brother. She lands in North Africa, and a local king says, okay, you can have as much land as you can cover with a single ox hide. A raw deal, right? Well, Dido, being incredibly clever, cut the hide into one super long, super thin strip and used it to encircle an entire hill. It's a great story because it tells you exactly how the Carthaginians saw themselves: smart, resourceful, and always finding a clever way to get the upper hand.
And the location she chose? Pure strategic brilliance. It was a peninsula so it was easy to defend. It had a massive, perfect natural harbor and rich farmland. But here's the key. It sat right at the narrowest point in the Mediterranean. It was the perfect choke point to control all the trade, all the money flowing from east to west.
The absolute crown jewel of the city was its amazing man-made harbor, the Kothon. Look at this design. There's a big rectangular outer port for all the merchant ships, open to the world. But then there's a secret, circular inner harbor just for the military. It could hide more than 200 warships, and it was completely invisible from the open sea. It was an engineering marvel, and it was Carthage in a nutshell. A commercial empire on the outside with some serious military muscle hidden just out of sight. But Carthage wasn't the only player in the game. As it got richer and more powerful, it was pretty much inevitable that it would clash with the other big powers who wanted control of those same valuable trade routes. For a long, long time, their main rivals were the Greeks. They were always fighting over territory, especially the super fertile island of Sicily. It was a centuries-long tug of war. But while they were so busy with the Greeks, a new power was growing just across the water in Italy, a city that was disciplined, ambitious, and just relentless. And that city was Rome.
This quote just says it all. It's from a Greek king, Pyrrhus, who had just fought and lost to both the Carthaginians and the Romans in Sicily. He saw what was coming with crystal clarity. As he sailed away, he knew he was leaving the island to be a wrestling ground for the two new superpowers of the Mediterranean. He knew a much bigger, much more brutal fight was about to begin.
And that fight, the First Punic War, didn't start with some grand invasion. It started with a messy little argument over a small city. But it would force Rome, a land-based empire, to do something it had never done before:
challenged the absolute masters of the sea.
The whole thing kicked off in Messina, a key city that controlled the waterway between Sicily and Italy. A group of mercenaries there got themselves into a jam, and in a moment of panic, they asked both Rome and Carthage for help. Bad move. The moment Rome decided to get involved, it put them on a direct collision course with Carthage. And just like that, a local squabble was about to become a world war.
On paper, a fight at sea should have been no contest. Carthage had a 1,000-year naval tradition going back to their Phoenician ancestors. Rome, they were a nation of farmers and foot soldiers. Their navy was basically a joke. How could they possibly win?
Well, for starters, they got a massive stroke of luck. A state-of-the-art Carthaginian warship ran aground on the coast of Italy, and the Romans captured it. Being the brilliant engineers they were, they took it apart, figured out how it worked, and then built an entire fleet of copies. But they knew a copy wasn't as good as the real thing. They needed an ace up their sleeve.
And that ace was a brilliant and brutal invention called the corvus, or the crow. It was basically a huge, spiked boarding bridge. The Romans knew they couldn't outsail the Carthaginians, so they decided not to. They'd just get close enough to drop this thing, locking the two ships together, and suddenly it wasn't a sea battle anymore, it was a land battle on floating planks of wood. And nobody, but nobody, beat Roman legionaries in a land battle. It was classic Roman thinking. If you can't win the game, change the rules.
The first time they used it at the Battle of Mylae, it was pure shock and awe. The Carthaginian fleet, totally overconfident, charged straight at the rookie Roman navy, expecting an easy win. They had no idea what was waiting for them. 1 second, they're sailing circles around the Romans. The next, slam! These giant bridges crash down on their decks, and their ships are swarming with soldiers. In an instant, Carthage's naval superiority was gone. It was a complete shock, and it changed the entire war.
But even with Rome's new toy, the war dragged on for over 2 decades. It was just a brutal, grinding meat grinder of a conflict that bled both empires dry of men and money, and it ended in a crushing defeat for Carthage.
I mean, can you imagine fighting a single war for 23 straight years? A whole generation grew up knowing nothing but conflict. By the end, both sides were on their knees. But Rome had an almost endless supply of citizen soldiers they could call on. Carthage relied on mercenaries, which cost a fortune, and eventually they just ran out of cash.
The peace treaty Rome forced on them was absolutely devastating. As you can see, Carthage lost all of Sicily, which was its richest province. They were forced to pay a staggering 82 times tons of silver to Rome. And then, the final humiliation. All Roman prisoners were returned for free, but Carthage had to pay a ransom to get its own soldiers back. This wasn't just about winning. This was about crippling your rivals so they could never get up again.
The general who had to accept these terrible terms was a man named Hamilcar Barca. He was a brilliant commander who was still winning battles in Sicily when the government surrendered. Being forced to accept this defeat filled him with this deep, personal, burning hatred for Rome, a hatred that he would pass on to his children.
23 years, an entire generation that knew nothing but war. In that time, the balance of power in the Mediterranean was completely rewritten. Rome was now a naval power, and Carthage, the 1,000-year-old empire of the sea, had been brought to its knees.
So this leaves us with a huge question. How does a shattered empire even begin to recover? And what happens when a father's vow of vengeance is inherited by a son who turns out to be one of the greatest military geniuses in all of human history? Well, that is a story for another time.